I've always considered my apartment a sanctuary, a modest one-bedroom loft with just enough space to feel comfortable but not cluttered. The day had been long, filled with the usual grind of meetings and deadlines. As I turned the key in the lock, the familiar creak of the door greeted me. I tossed my keys on the counter and slumped onto the couch, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on me. The city outside hummed with life, but inside, it was a world of quiet solitude, just the way I like it. The digital clock on the wall blinked 11:30 p.m. The faint glow from the streetlight outside seeped through the thin curtains. I poured myself a whiskey and turned on my laptop. This is a habit I formed to help me relax before bedtime. I loaded a game, and as I was about to start playing, an advertisement popped on the screen. It read, "Hot new game. Become a human target and outsmart your team of hunters. Join now." Cool, I thought, and clicked on the advert. This took me to a sign-up page where I entered all my personal details and started the game. I played for about 30 minutes before my eyes fluttered as sleep overcame me, and without even changing out of my clothes, I went to my bedroom, laid on the bed, and drifted off. The room was so dark it pressed against my eyelids, making sleep deep and dreamless. But then a sound so soft crept into my consciousness. It was a soft click, like a lock being tampered with. In my groggy state, I brushed it off as the usual creaks and groans of an old apartment. But then there was another sound. This time it was unmistakable, the quiet, deliberate turning of the doorknob. My heart thudded in my chest as adrenaline shot through my veins, yanking me out of my sleep. Before I could fully grasp what was happening, the door to my bedroom swung open with a slow, agonizing creak. A shadowy figure stood in the doorway, faceless in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped closer, the outline of a gun visible in the dark. Paralyzed by fear, I couldn't move. In an instant, rough hands grabbed me, yanking me from the bed. A sharp, stinging pain spread across my face as a rag soaked in chemicals was pressed against my mouth and nose. The world around me spun, then everything faded to black. I woke up to a cold, hard surface beneath me. I could smell damp earth and something metallic. Where the hell am I thought as I realized I was no longer in my apartment. Panic surged as I tried to move, but my hands were bound tightly behind my back, the rough rope cutting into my skin. My heart raced, pounding against my ribs as I struggled to make sense of my surroundings. A dim, flickering light came from a single weak bulb hanging overhead. The room was large. It felt almost as if I was in a cave with stone walls that seemed to press in from all sides. I could hear the distant sound of water dripping. It sounded like footsteps were coming closer as I could hear shoes on the cold stone floor. My pulse quickened, the fear gripping me like a vice. A door creaked open and several figures stepped into the dim light. They wore masks, grotesque, animal-like masks that hid their features entirely. "Welcome to the game," one of them said, their voice distorted through a modulator. "You're the prey." The terror that had taken hold of my heart at that moment was unbearable. I then realized the situation I was in. I was in the middle of some sadistic game I had signed up for just a few hours ago. But this was no game. It was real. The masked figures circled me, their eyes hidden behind the lifeless masks. "You'll be given a 5-minute head start," the leader said, stepping closer. The mask they wore resembled a wolf's snarling face, the empty eye socket staring into my soul. "After that, the hunt begins. 10 of us will come after you, and we won't stop until we've claimed our prize." My breath came in ragged gasps as the gravity of the situation hit me. I was the prey in a deadly game, my only chance of survival lying in the small head start they were granting me. "You have 5 minutes," the leader repeated. "Better make them count." With that, the ropes binding my hands were cut and I was shoved toward a large iron door on the far side of the room. My legs felt like jelly, but the primal instinct to survive overpowered the paralysis of fear. I sprinted toward the door, bursting through it and into the unknown. Outside, the night was pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick clouds. The cold bit at my skin as I ran. The estate was massive, a sprawling expanse of dense forest and rough terrain. Leaves crunched and twigs snapped as I ran. My mind raced as I pushed myself deeper into the forest. I had no idea where I was or how far I needed to go. The only thing I knew for certain was that time was ticking and soon the hunters would be unleashed. My lungs burned with every breath, my muscles aching as I forced myself onward. The darkness was disorienting, every step a blind leap into the unknown. But there was no time to stop, no time to think. The only thing that mattered was putting as much distance as possible between myself and the hunters. Suddenly the silence was shattered by the distant sound of a horn, a long haunting note that echoed through the trees. The hunt had begun. The horn was soon followed by the distant howls of the hunters. They were far enough away that the sounds blended with the wind, but the terror was real and close, always there. My 5 minutes were up. I was no longer running away, but running for my life. My heart pounded in my chest as the fear pushed me forward. My feet tore through the underbrush, snapping twigs and sending animals scurrying in every direction. Every branch that scratched my face, every stone that threatened to trip me up, only heightened my sense of desperation. The hunters were close, too close. I could feel their presence, could sense their eyes tracking me in the darkness. My mind raced, searching for any strategy, any way to outsmart the hunters. I knew the forest was vast, and if I could find a place to hide, I might have a chance. But the hunters were skilled, experienced predators who had done this many times before. They knew the terrain, the tricks, the traps. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pushed myself harder, ignoring the pain that shot through my legs and the fear gnawing at my sanity. I had to survive. I had to find a way out. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees becoming thicker, the paths more treacherous. The hunters were gaining ground, their movements more calculated, more deliberate. My mind was clouded with fear, my thoughts fragmented as I tried to think of a way out, but the options were few and the time was slipping away. Then I stumbled upon a small clearing, the ground uneven and littered with fallen branches. The moon had emerged from behind the clouds, which wasn't really in my favor as the hunters could now see me more clearly. I stopped for a bit, trying to catch my breath and trying to gather my thoughts, but then I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from all sides. I was surrounded. The hunters emerged from the shadows, their guns aimed at me, their masks reflecting the moonlight in a grotesque display. There was no escape, no way out. I was trapped, caught in the grip of a nightmare that had no end. "Game over," the leader said, stepping forward with the same distorted voice. The muzzle of his gun was pointed directly at my chest, and I could see the cold glint of metal in the moonlight. There was no pity, no remorse in those masked eyes, only the thrill of the hunt, the satisfaction of the kill. But I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Not like this. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged at the nearest hunter, grabbing for the gun. We crashed to the ground, the struggle fierce and violent. The other hunters hesitated, unsure of what to do without risking shooting their own. I fought with everything I had, using every ounce of strength, every bit of energy left in my battered body. The gun went off, the shot ringing out in the night, but I didn't stop. I managed to wrestle the gun from the hunter's grip, turning it on my captors in a desperate act of self-preservation. The blast echoed through the clearing and the hunter fell limp, the life draining from his body. The other hunters reacted instantly, raising their guns to fire. But I was faster. I fired again and again, the shots wild and desperate, but enough to force the others to retreat. For a moment the forest was silent again. The only sound was my ragged breathing. I had won, at least for now. The hunt wasn't over, not by a long shot. I knew I couldn't stay there, not with the bodies of the hunters at my feet, not with the others regrouping and planning their next move. I had to keep moving, had to find a way out of the forest, out of this nightmare. I grabbed what I could from the fallen hunters, ammunition, a knife, anything that might give me an edge. Then I bolted back into the forest, my body screaming in protest, but my mind focused solely on survival. The adrenaline coursing through my veins was the only thing keeping me on my feet, pushing me to run faster, to think sharper. Every sound in the forest, every rustle of leaves sent my nerves into overdrive. The hunters were regrouping, no doubt furious and more determined than ever. I couldn't afford another direct confrontation. I had to find a way to outsmart them. The terrain grew more rugged and rough as I ran, the forest floor sloping downward into a dense thicket. I could smell the pine and the damp earth. The moon had disappeared behind the clouds, and the darkness was pressing in on me from all sides. My mind raced as I tried to recall the layout of the estate from the glimpses I had caught earlier. There had to be a boundary, a fence, something I could use to escape. The forest seemed endless. The hunters had chosen this place for a reason. It was designed to trap and disorient their prey. My thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of voices, the hunters communicating with each other, spreading out to cover more ground. They were closing in again, and time was running out. I forced myself to slow down, to move more carefully. I couldn't risk making a noise or leaving a trail. Every step was deliberate, every breath controlled. I knew the hunters were skilled, but they didn't know the terror and desperation that drove me. I had to use that to my advantage. As I ran deeper into the forest, the trees became thicker. It was so dark I could barely see a few feet in front of me. But I pressed on, my instincts guiding me as much as my fear. Just as I began to lose hope, I stumbled upon a narrow ravine. The drop was steep, the bottom obscured by overgrown vegetation. It was a risk, but staying in the forest meant certain death. I had to take my chances. I carefully made my way down the side of the ravine, using roots and rocks for support. The descent was slow and dangerous, but I couldn't afford to fall. Not now, not when survival was so close. My hands were scraped and bloody by the time I reached the bottom, but I didn't stop. I had to keep moving. The ravine was narrow, but it offered cover, something the hunters wouldn't expect. I could hear them above, their footsteps crushing leaves and twigs. I could hear them coming through the trees, but they didn't know where I was. I was safe, at least for the moment. I crept along the ravine, my senses on high alert. The hunters were searching for me, their frustration evident in their voices. But the ravine was my lifeline, my chance to outmaneuver them. I just had to stay quiet and stay hidden. As I continued through the ravine, I came across a small stream. It wasn't much, but it could cover my scent, mask my trail. I stepped into the stream, the icy water sending a shock through my system, and began wading upstream. The sound of the water drowned out the hunters' voices, giving me a small sense of relief. But the hunters were relentless. They knew their prey was close, and they weren't going to give up. I could hear them getting nearer, their voices louder, more agitated. They were closing in. Then I heard a sharp crack like a branch breaking. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The sound had come from up ahead, in the direction I was heading. The hunters were everywhere, surrounding me, closing the noose. My mind raced. I had to think fast, had to find a way out. I noticed a small cave-like opening in the side of the ravine, hidden behind a tangle of roots and vines. It was barely big enough for me to squeeze through, but it was my only option. I quickly waded to the edge of the stream and pulled myself into the narrow opening. The darkness inside was suffocating, the air damp and musty. I could hardly breathe. I had to stifle my breathing, had to stay absolutely still. The hunters were right above me now, their voices almost directly overhead. The minutes ticked by like hours. I could hear the hunters searching, their frustration growing, but they didn't find me. The ravine, the stream, the cave, it had all worked. For now, I had outsmarted them. The cave offered temporary relief, but I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I needed a plan, a way to escape the estate entirely. My thoughts turned to the possibility of a perimeter fence. Most private estates had one, and if I could find it, I might be able to climb over or find a weak spot. But first, I needed to get out of the ravine without alerting the hunters, so I waited until the voices faded into the distance before cautiously emerging from the cave. It was still very dark, but the moon was beginning to rise, offering a faint silvery light. I moved quickly and quietly, my body running on pure adrenaline. The ravine led me to a flatter area of the forest where the trees were sparser and the ground more even. I knew I was getting closer to the edge of the estate. I could feel it. In the distance, I saw the faint outline of a fence just visible in the moonlight. It was tall, probably electrified, but it was the only thing standing between me and freedom. I had no choice but to try. I approached cautiously, my eyes scanning for any sign of movement. The hunters were still out there, but they seemed to be farther away, still searching the ravine. I reached the fence and began searching for a weak spot, something I could exploit. I found a section where the ground had eroded beneath the fence, leaving just enough space for me to crawl under. It was risky. If the fence was electrified, it could be the end. But I had no other choice. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I had to do. I grabbed a long stick and carefully tested the area beneath the fence. No sparks, no hum of electricity. This section was inactive, probably due to the erosion. It was my one and only shot. I dropped to the ground and began to crawl under the fence. The space was tight, the dirt felt cold and damp against my skin. I moved slowly, deliberately, not daring to breathe until I was on the other side. Finally, I was through. I stood up, my heart pounding, and looked back at the estate. The forest was behind me, but I was free. I had escaped the nightmare. But the relief was short-lived. In the distance, I heard the unmistakable sound of a horn, different from before, more urgent. They knew I had escaped. The hunt wasn't over, not yet. I started running again, pushing myself to the limit. The terrain outside the estate was rough and unfamiliar, but I didn't care. I had to put as much distance between myself and the hunters as possible. I ran through the night, the fear and adrenaline driving me forward. The sound of pursuit was way in the distance, but still present. I wasn't safe yet. But as the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, I felt a glimmer of hope. I had been running for hours. My body was on the brink of collapse, but I couldn't stop now. I had to keep going, had to find safety. I stumbled upon a small abandoned cabin stuck in a clearing. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it offered shelter, a place to rest and regroup. I cautiously approached the door, my eyes scanning the area for any sign of danger. The cabin was empty, dusty, and cold, but it was a haven compared to the forest. I collapsed onto the floor, my body trembling with exhaustion. I had made it this far. I could survive the rest. But then the sound of footsteps outside the cabin shattered my brief moment of peace. The hunters had found me. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing. There was no way out, no back door, no window large enough to escape through. I was trapped and the hunters were closing in. The door burst open and the leader stepped inside, gun raised, the wolf mask glinting in the morning light. I knew this was it, the final showdown. I grabbed the knife I had taken from the hunter earlier and faced the leader, his eyes filled with determination. He wasn't going down without a fight. The leader fired, but I was ready. I dodged to the side, the bullet missing me by inches. I lunged forward, the knife aimed at the leader's chest. We collided in a violent struggle. The leader's strength was overwhelming, but my will was unbreakable. The fight was brutal, primal. Every move was a battle for survival, every second a fight against death. The other hunters were outside, watching, waiting for their leader to finish the job. But I wouldn't let that happen. With a final desperate push, I drove the knife into the leader's chest, the blade sinking deep into his flesh. The leader's eyes widened in shock, the mask slipping from his face, revealing the cold, lifeless stare beneath. The leader fell to the ground, the life draining from his body. I stood over him. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my hands shaking. I had won. I had survived. The other hunters hesitated, their confidence shattered by the loss of their leader. They weren't expecting this. They weren't prepared for prey that fought back. Slowly, one by one, they lowered their weapons and backed away. I watched them retreat, my body tense, ready for another attack. But it didn't come. The hunters vanished into the forest, leaving me alone in the clearing. The sun was fully up now, bathing the landscape in warm light. I stepped out of the cabin, the weight of the night's events finally lifting from my shoulders. I had made it through the nightmare. But the scars would remain. The fear, the terror, the memory of the hunt. I knew I would never be the same, that the events of that night would haunt me for the rest of my life. But I was alive, and that was enough. As I walked away from the cabin, away from the forest, I felt a sense of peace. The hunters were gone. The nightmare was over. And now finally I was free. But I will never, for as long as I live, ever click on another new hot game.